Imagine Massachusetts, like, issuing an apology for the Salem witch trials, almost 300 years after it happened. Wild, right? Well, that's what happened in 1957. And it kind of shows you just how much this one historical event, like, still resonates with us today. So, today, we're going on a deep dive into the Salem witch trials to figure out, what really went down in that Puritan pressure cooker back in 1692 and 1693. And you might be surprised to learn that even, 350 years later, we're still kind of deciphering this historical puzzle. So to help us separate fact from fiction, we have Dr. Jessica Parr with us, a true expert in early modern Atlantic history. So when we think of Salem, we often picture this like, small, isolated village, shrouded in darkness and fear. Is that image accurate?
Well, Salem was actually a pretty spread out area, more like a region than a village. It even included what's now Danvers, Massachusetts. And it's interesting, Danvers tries to distance itself from the witch trials, while Salem has kind of embraced, its darker side, especially for the tourist.
It's like they're dealing with the same past, but in two totally different ways. But you mentioned Salem being a region, so it wasn't just this tiny, isolated village like we always see in the movies.
Exactly. Even today, it's not the easiest place to get to. So imagine back then, it was incredibly remote. Travel was difficult, and the population was pretty small. So everyone knew everyone else, which made these Puritan communities, very close-knit, but also sometimes a bit contentious.
And the Puritan church played a huge role in their lives, right? I mean, we're talking 17th century. Religious tension is high all over Europe.
Absolutely. These New England settlements were basically theocracies. The Congregationalist churches were at the center of everything, and the church leaders held a lot of power. Salem Village, in particular, was known for being, particularly quarrelsome. They cycled through 4 ministers in a short period. And then comes Reverend Samuel Parris. Let's just say he didn't exactly smooth things over.
Ah, Reverend Terrace, the Puritan hardliner. I bet his arrival just added fuel to the fire.
You could say that. He faced a lot of pushback from the community, which, added to the already tense atmosphere.
And this is where things start to get really interesting, right? This is where we get into the witchy stuff. Reverend Parris's daughter and niece start acting very strangely, almost like something out of The Exorcist.
It was bizarre behavior, for sure. And you have to remember, belief in the supernatural, especially the devil, was like a core part of the Puritan worldview. So when the girls started screaming, convulsing, contorting their bodies, people immediately thought witchcraft.
So it's like all the ingredients for a perfect storm were already in place. But to understand how things escalated so quickly, we need to look at the bigger picture, right? Witchcraft accusations weren't unique to Salem. They had deep roots in European history.
You're absolutely right. We have to go back to Europe. And the Protestant Reformation, all those new denominations and sects, vying for power and legitimacy, it created a lot of tension and religious conflict.
Okay, so Europe's a powder keg, religiously. But how did that tension carry over to the colonies?
Well, think about England. They executed their own king, Charles I. There are even stories of people like dipping handkerchiefs in his blood. That's how intense things were. So in this climate of fear and uncertainty, witchcraft accusations became a way to, explain the unexplainable. If something bad happened, it must be Satan and his witches.
So witchcraft was a scapegoat for all the anxieties of the time.
Exactly. And the methods used to deal with accused witches were brutal. Think the Spanish Inquisition and English Inquisitions. Torture was common.
So we've got this volatile mix of religious extremism and a history of brutal witch hunts coming over from Europe. And then in Salem, you have Reverend Parris, a strict Puritan minister trying to control a community that's already on edge. What could possibly go wrong?
That's the question, isn't it? And to make matters worse, Parris's daughter and niece were involved with Tipa, an enslaved woman who had a background in indigenous and possibly African spiritual tradition.
Wait, Tita, wasn't she the one who confessed to witchcraft?
She did, but under duress. Imagine being an enslaved woman, accused of something so terrifying. In a society that already views you as different and dangerous, her confession was likely a survival tactic. She even described familiar satanic images, like black dogs, and a man with white hair, the kind of imagery straight out of Puritan sermons.
So her confession, even though it was likely coerced, actually ended up fueling the hysteria.
Unfortunately, yes. It was like she unknowingly gave them the proof they were looking for, which, further solidified their fears about witchcraft in Salem.
This is where it gets really chilling. It starts with these young girls, but the accusations quickly spread outward, targeting some of the most vulnerable people in the community.
You're talking about Sarah Good, the homeless beggar, And Sarah Osborne, the elderly impoverished woman, they were easy targets,
Right.
especially alongside Tituba, the enslaved woman.
It's almost like a playbook for how witch hunts unfold, targeting those who are already marginalized and powerless.
Sadly, yes. And we have to remember that there were real people behind these accusations, real lives shattered by fear and suspicion.
Okay, so we've set the stage. A community on edge, a strict religious leader, strange behavior, and a history of witch hunts in Europe. So what happens next? How do these accusations escalate into full-blown trials? This is where I think we need to dig deeper and understand the legal and social mechanisms that allowed this tragedy to unfold.
Well, that's a great place to pick up next. We'll delve into the trials themselves, the role of the powerful Mather family, and the use of something called spectral evidence. This whole other can of worms.
So we left off with Tituba's confession, likely made under, extreme duress, which sadly only added fuel to the fire. And the accusations didn't stop there, right? It's like the entire community was caught in this web of fear and suspicion. But how did these accusations actually turn into formal trial?
We have to remember, this is a small, isolated community, right? Gossip spreads fast, and fear even faster. Soon, accusations were just flying everywhere, fueled by personal grudges, rivalries, you name it. It was like the trials themselves became a weapon to use against anyone you didn't like.
It's almost like the whole thing just spiraled out of control, starting with whispers and rumors and ending with, people's lives being destroyed. But there had to be some kind of legal process, right? How did they actually go about trying these accused witches?
They set up a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer. But this wasn't your typical court. Think of it more like a commission with a very specific mission: to find and punish witches. And here's the kicker. They allowed something called spectral evidence.
Hold on, spectral evidence? What exactly is that? It sounds pretty spooky.
Basically, it means that dreams and visions could be used as evidence in court. So if someone testified that they saw your spirit or specter doing something harmful, that could be used against you, even if there was no physical proof.
So you could be convicted based on someone's dream. That doesn't seem very fair.
It wasn't. In fact, Increase Mather, a prominent Puritan minister and president of Harvard, had argued against using spectral evidence just a few years earlier. He knew how easily it could be manipulated.
Wait a minute, so even some of the Puritans thought this was a bad idea?
Yes. There were definitely dissenting voices, but unfortunately, they were kind of drowned out by the rising tide of fear and adding to the chaos was Increase Mather's son.
Cotton Mather.
Cotton Mather. From what I've read, he wasn't exactly known for his, level-headedness.
Let's just say. He was a very strong advocate for the trials and truly believed that spectral evidence was valid. He was a powerful figure in the community, and his views carried a lot of weight.
It's almost Shakespearean, right? Father and son on opposite sides of this incredibly charged issue. And in the midst of all this escalating crisis, you have the Governor Phipps, try to make sense of it all.
Governor Phipps is a fascinating figure. He initially supported the trials, but as things spiraled out of control, he started having second thoughts. Imagine the pressure he was under, trying to appease the powerful Puritan clergy, while also, maintaining order in the colony. He was walking a tightrope, trying to balance religious fervor with the practical realities of, governing. It must have been a tough position to be in.
Absolutely. But eventually, even he couldn't ignore the injustices that were happening. He dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which was a huge turning point in the trials. He replaced it with a regular court, the Superior Court of Judicature, which, at least followed more traditional legal procedures.
So that was a step in the right direction.
Definitely. And the new court refused to consider spectral evidence. As a result, many of the remaining accused were acquitted or released. But sadly, for some, it was too late.
20 people had already lost their lives, and it's not just the executions themselves that are so horrifying. It's the methods they used to get confessions. You mentioned pressing before. That's how Giles Corey died, right? Refused to confess. And they just piled rocks on his chest until he suffocated.
It's a brutal image, and it really speaks to the level of cruelty that fear can breed. And you're right to point out the gender dynamics of the trials. The vast majority of those accused and convicted were women.
It feels like a pattern throughout history, right? Whenever there's fear and upheaval, women are often the first to be targeted, especially if they, don't conform to social norms.
Exactly. And in Salem, many of the accused women were those who challenged traditional gender roles. They were outspoken, independent, or in some way, stepped outside the boundaries of what was considered acceptable behavior for women.
And they paid a terrible price for it. It's almost unimaginable. The level of fear and paranoia that must have gripped that community.
Imagine your neighbor, someone you've known for years, suddenly accusing you of witchcraft based on a dream they had. It's like something out of a nightmare. But that was the reality of Salem. Accusations were often rooted in, like, petty jealousies, personal vendettas, long-standing feuds. It's a chilling reminder of how fear can twist even the most basic human instincts, turning friends into enemies and neighbors into accusers.
It makes you wonder how a community recovers from something like that once the dust settles and the hysteria subsides. How do you even begin to heal those wounds?
It wasn't easy, but there was a recognition that they had gone too far. In 1702, the trials were officially declared unlawful, and in 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring the rights and good names of those who'd been accused. They even offered financial restitution to their families. It was an attempt, however imperfect, to right the wrongs of the past.
So there was at least an effort to acknowledge the injustices and try to make amends. But the scars of Salem run deep, right? It's a story that continues to fascinate and haunt us, not just for the historical details, but for what it reveals about human nature, the power of fear, and the dangers of unchecked authority.
And it raises these important questions
Yeah.
about how we as individuals and as a society respond to fear and uncertainty. Do we give in to panic and suspicion? Or do we choose reason, compassion, and justice? The story of Salem is a warning, I think, a reminder that even in the most civilized societies, darkness can take root and spread with terrifying speed.
It's a sobering thought, and it makes you wonder, why did this happen specifically in New England? Were there similar events happening in other colonies at the time? It's a good question. Why Salem? Why there?
Yeah.
Was there something unique about New England that made it ripe for this kind of mass hysteria?
Right.
Well, remember how we talked about the Puritans? Seeing themselves as a city on a hill, they truly believed they were chosen by God, which made them incredibly sensitive to anything that threatened their religious purity.
So any deviation from their strict beliefs
Yep.
was seen as a direct attack on their entire way of life, almost like an invitation for the devil himself
Yeah.
to set up shop in Salem.
Exactly. Now, compare that to a colony like Virginia. They were mostly Anglican, right?
Right.
With a lot less internal religious conflict. They didn't have that same level of intensity.
Or fear of spiritual contamination.
So the very foundation of New England society,
Okay.
with its rigid religious beliefs and all, actually made it more vulnerable to these kinds of accusations.
That's a big part of it, yeah. But there's another factor to consider. Change. The Salem witch trials happened during a time when the Puritan grip on society was starting to loosen. New ideas were coming in from Europe. Trade was expanding, and the old ways were being
I
challenged.
feel like the trials were a reaction to all that change, a desperate attempt to, cling to a world that was slipping away.
It's a fascinating theory. When people feel threatened, when the world is changing in ways they don't understand, they often look for someone to blame. And in Salem, those who didn't fit the mold, independent women, people on the fringes of society, they became easy targets.
It's a chilling reminder that, history often repeats itself. We see it time and time again during periods of social upheaval, economic uncertainty, or political turmoil. There's this urge to find a scapegoat, to channel all that fear and anger onto those who are, different or vulnerable.
And it's so important to recognize these patterns, to be critical thinkers, to question assumptions, and to resist the temptation, to simplify these complex issues. The Salem witch trials were a stark warning, really, against giving in to fear and prejudice.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Salem witch trials, I'm struck by how much this one event has resonated throughout history. It's more than just a historical curiosity, It's a story that forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about how easily fear can take root, how quickly accusations can escalate, and how even well-intentioned people can get swept up in this tide of hysteria and injustice.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
And I think it's fitting to end with this question. Could something like the Salem witch trials happen again? Perhaps not with, witches and cauldrons, but in a different form, right?
Right.
Driven by the same underlying forces of fear, suspicion, and the abuse of power.
It's a question worth pondering, for sure. And as we go about our lives, let's remember the lessons of Salem. Let's be vigilant, challenge assumptions, and stand up for those who are marginalized and vulnerable. Because as we've learned from this deep dive, history has a way of repeating itself, if we're not careful.
Well said. And thank you for having me on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating conversation.
It certainly has. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. into the heart of the Salem witch trials. We hope you've learned something new, gained a deeper understanding of this complex event, and perhaps even found yourself questioning your own assumptions about the past and the present. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.